Well, good evening. This is Tim Barczak with the ESP Quality Department at the NEA, and I'm introducing Tom White for tonight's presentation. Tom White is the coordinator of education outreach at the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies of Keene State College. Tom has awards and recognitions too numerous to list, so we'll pick just one. He is a recipient of the NEA New Hampshire Champion of Human and Civil Rights Award. And without further ado, because I know that Tom has a lot of material to cover tonight, I will hand it over to Tom. Thank you, Tom, and welcome.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for hosting this evening. And what, of course, is a very timely and difficult topic. And what I'd like to try to do this evening is to sort of look at how does Holocaust and genocide education inform us about American racism, and for us the direct connection, of course, will be how much the Nazis modeled their early racial laws and policies on U.S. precedent. And that might be a bit surprising for some, and we'll see how this goes. At the end, I'd be curious about the difficulties you face in dealing with this in your classroom. So I'm going to just begin, and whatever questions come to the fore, please type them in, and we'll see if we can deal with them at the very end of the presentation. Three guiding questions I have as we look at sort of these parallel charts of American eugenics on the left and the Nazi laws, the Nuremberg laws in 1935, that have very eerie similarity to them. And first of all, how do we engage our own history in the United States before, of course, looking at Nazi Germany? How do we unpack mythical constructs of that racial history? Because we're going to see very similar, I would argue, sort of mythological arguments, both from the Nazis and from America in creating a racial divide. And finally, and really poignantly, I think, will be how did U.S. racism influence Nazi German racial policy? So to begin, Hitler, of course, comes to power in January of 1933. And one of his, of course, early focuses, as he whispers at the opening of the Reichstag, is that he will be working on Jewish policy almost immediately. And in September of that year, he sends a memorandum out to the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, which at that time was the largest police department in Germany, before, of course, the SS coordinates that on a nationwide level. And he directed German political and legal minds. And again, when you're looking at Nazism, it's very important to see that you had educated people sort of jumping on board, which will validate the Nazi movement. And he wanted them to wrestle with the Jewish question, so-called priority in Nazism. The memo demanded criminalization of racially mixed marriages, sought to do away with the Weimar Republic's criminal law code. So this was going to be a huge undertaking, and clearly lawyers would have to be involved in this. And looking at those priorities in that memo, immediately attention turned to the United States, which had been held in high esteem by German eugenicists. And there had been many sort of cross the Atlantic Ocean conferences between German and American eugenics. And so this memo would be the beginning of what 2 years later would produce the Nuremberg laws. The memo would send a fact-finding mission of experts to the United States to research how, in fact, we did it. It's a very chilling thought to realize the Nazis began their racial policy by asking, how did the Americans do theirs? Now, before the Nazi fact-finding mission had come over, there had been a previous one. So this is a practice that had been going on. And this one was at the turn of the 20th century. And the fact-finding mission was to find racial policies that would be precedent for German lawyers in the American tradition in implementation of their colonial policy in Southwest Africa that we know becomes genocide. So when the German delegation arrives in the U.S., they go to the Jim Crow South. They begin to consult with American scholars, eugenics experts, and to sort of watch what goes on in the South. And of course, what they discovered, and what we're about to discover, I think is quite chilling. They concluded that Jim Crow is too radical for Nazi Germany. I think it's a very chilling statement. First statement, of course, being that they asked how the Americans did it before they began. And second of all, that Jim Crow is too radical. By that, what Hitler meant and what the lawyers meant was that for Germany, they worked on precedent. Judges were not elected. Things had to be really clear in their jurisprudence. And what they realized, that all the different methods the Americans have used to disenfranchise, in this case, black Americans, although others as well as we will see are disenfranchised. These are tricks, poll taxes, these kind of things that would never translate into Germany. So something else had to be discovered. And so the Nazis researched more. They were here for a while and discovered something else. And I think it's very important for Americans to wrestle with as well, that racism is not a Southern phenomenon. It is an American one. And what the Nazis begin to discover are, as you can see on the screen, a real history of American racism that was institutionalized. On the right-hand side, though, becomes what will be their scientific and legal justification for the acts they're about to take. And it'll be the American Eugenics Program. And we have, of course, the Racial Integrity Act in Virginia, 1924, certifying here that you are of the proper race. And in that case, in America at that time, it very much meant white Protestant, European heritage. And, of course, from this came IQ tests. That's a whole other different story. Down below, you can see a Nazi map of 1936, after the Nuremberg laws, showing 48 states with restrictions on Negro rights. And so clearly, even after the Nuremberg laws, they're still researching and utilizing American precedent for their racial policy. If you have not subscribed to this, this is one I would recommend, of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance magazine. And in this particular issue, it talks about teaching difficult history, and in this case, about American slavery. And the guiding principles they have, I think, are really useful. And one would be that we must make sure in our classroom that we teach that slavery is foundational to the establishment of America and for the American experience. And as we know today, even political and social institutions are still affected by that slave history. I think also it's important to realize that slavery is not simply a Southern issue. Every colony that declared its independence in 1776 had slavery. When you talk explicitly about racism, I think you must talk about white supremacy in your classroom, and of course this might become very difficult for you, and we hope tonight to sort of navigate that together. White supremacy is the oxygen for slavery, and it is the oxygen, I will argue, for things to be very concerned about in our republic today. Humanize the targets is a standard practice for all of us in the field, of course, where we don't try to victimize the people we're studying, but make them humans, to study how they lived, what they preferred to do, what their lives were like. And then finally use primary sources for students to wrestle with. And so you become a facilitator, not, of course, the knowledgeable person from the pulpit, but allowing people to engage with the primary documents about slavery and enslavers. I would be curious at the end what kind of documents you use for that. The framework for exploring tonight in U.S. racism that will lead to Nazi racism as well, I'm going to take this particular framework from Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning. And he says there are three sort of things going on in racial America in trying to engage this topic. And the three groups he would link together, first of all, as segregationists. These are our racists who believe that races are inferior, that because of their biological makeup, they are, in fact, deserving of their fate, and will justify all the claims they make, which is to disenfranchise them and today, of course, arrest them in large numbers, by blaming them, by saying that all evil, all violence, all corruption comes from their racial inferiority, and it's up to us, of course, to stop that. As an example, there are many, of course, to use, but this one just pulling out from CNN from this past July, and this comes from Minnesota. A Republican representative called recipients of welfare and government assistance parasites and scoundrels, and said that the black community had traded one plantation for another. So clearly in his mind, he's still rooted in that slave past. And of course, he did this on a conservative radio talk show that he hosts. He also attacks women, which, by the way, in the field of genocide studies, we also know that misogyny is a huge factor in the acceleration toward genocide and mass atrocity crimes. He criticizes women, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act. He called that one of the worst laws, suggesting here that it might be the cause of workplace shootings. And so you can see how a segregationist and a racist would twist the things back upon the target group as I said before. Assimilationists are one that I think most of us feel very comfortable with, but of course there's a few problems here. Assimilationists argue that yes, different races or minorities are already handicapped and they will accept some of the racial constructs in this. And what they will argue is we must overcome those racial limitations. And some of our great early thinkers, pre and post-Civil War, were actually in this camp. And what they were thinking of was redemption, saving races from themselves. And they would uplift races and groups through integration into white culture. And there's a picture here that has sort of not worked, but you can find all kinds of examples of this. If the idea was that you will then uplift people through integration, they will become more white, more Protestant, whatever those categories would be. Of course, it still doesn't work, and this is, of course, the experience of the indigenous people, the Native Americans, who, though their culture is taken away, their language is taken away, they're taught English, they're taught Catholicism, or, sorry, Christianity, still, if you can see the picture, they are still separate. They are not equal. Now, the anti-racists look at both of those previous camps and have this difficulty. They have to face two types of racist ideas. One, that people are inferior, the segregationists, or the assimilationists, that these people have to somehow be uplifted. And this is sort of the parachute idea, that we're going to drop in heroically, parachute onto them, and rescue them from themselves. They reject both of those constructs. So an anti-racist would simply argue for something different, which is what we are going to look at, and they simply say the problem here isn't the group being targeted, but it's the people doing the targeting. As we look at this particular argument, I think CNN is an easy example of the problem that immediately we face. It is often constructed as a winner-take-all scenario. And in this particular still that I have here, senators battle over Trump's immigration comment. In a typical sort of modern media way, you bring in those who are for, those who are against, and they yell at each other. And there is an inference here that the better argument will win and thus someone will lose. I think that kind of construct is what has held racism in such a potent form in our society and sort of humanity, in that I'm going to argue that it's a win-win if you deal with racism, in that racists tend to be a very small minority who often are led by a group of people who have very short-term agenda items for their own personal power. And, of course, once they start implementing racial policies or racist policies, it affects often the very people who had supported them in the first place. And that's what we need to sort of unpack. So I would argue majorities in this will not have to give anything up, but, in fact, will benefit once racism, institutional racism, of course, is mitigated. Racism hurts everyone, except, and here's the key, the elites who are promoting it for their own perceived short-term self-interest. Questions I'd like you to ask as you deal with this with your students, and I'm sure that you do anyway, and that, of course, who benefits from racism? And keep asking this question over and over again. The layers, of course, mean. I want to talk about the elites who are using this for their own short-term self-interest. But those who buy into it think they benefit as well, and we're about to find out, of course, that they don't. So we have choices to make, and choices, of course, do we ignore the explicit threat that we are facing as Americans right now? And down below you will see that since 2016, most of Americans' domestic terrorist actions have not been committed by Islamists, but by white supremacist American men, with no connection whatsoever to Islam. In 2017, Muslim Americans associated with violent extremism continue to fall, and the number of Americans killed by white supremacists in the U.S. last year was far higher. Over the last decade, 71% of all terrorist-related fatalities have been linked to domestic right-wing extremists, not Islamists. 26% of the killings were committed by Islamist extremists. Now, those figures that I'm quoting really were collected before the attacks of this past November of white supremacists in Pittsburgh, in Florida, in Tennessee, and so these figures, of course, are base starting figures. Above, of course, we have another explicit threat, I would argue, who is promoting white supremacy. Let them call you racist. Let them call you xenophobe. Let them call you nativist. Wear it as a badge of honor, because every day we get stronger and they get weaker. Steve Bannon, the former advisor to the president, of course, is speaking at France's right-wing National Front Congress with Marine Le Pen, who he is supporting. He has created a think tank, which of course represents an American overseas called the Movement, which has found support amongst anti-immigration movements in Europe, far-right groups, including the neo-fascist Brothers of Italy. And he currently was working, helping to organize Milorad Dodik's successful campaign to win one of the 3 seats of the Bosnian presidency. Dodik is from Srpska, and he is someone who denies there was a Bosnian genocide and basically is arguing that Bosnia should disappear, and basically the United States, through Bannon, although the United States is too broad of an umbrella, is supporting this kind of agenda. I think we need to be aware of that, how Americans are projecting themselves overseas in the terms of white supremacy. Down below you have 2 images, one from 1930s and one from 2017. I think you all recognize 2017 in Charlottesville. But you may not, of course, be as familiar with the one above. Everything that we are seeing in our culture isn't coming out of the blue, isn't made up. It is rooted in a historical experience. And in this case, the German-American Bund from the 1930s that had allied themselves with the KKK, with the America First Committee, and were desperate to keep America out of the war so that Hitler would win. They would hold rallies in Madison Square Garden as well. But for every rally that the Bund held, there were larger counter-demonstrations of Americans who opposed that kind of philosophy. And so this is an ongoing struggle. The other choice we have, of course, is to accept our responsibility to confront our history. The model for us, ironically, I think, is Germany, the only country that has gone out of its way to confront its past, to apologize for its crimes of the past, to find financial support for the victims of its previous crimes, and of course their education about the Holocaust is stellar. For we as Americans, we're just beginning, I think, to honestly confront our slave history. I quote Abraham Lincoln here, of course, twice, and as you know, Lincoln, as the Civil War begins, is not that interested in fighting a war to end slavery. That will come later. But it was in his heart, and he discovers this, of course, as the war goes on. 2 images I show on the right-hand side in Alabama, the new National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which, of course, confronts for the first time, in a real visceral way, our slave past. Ironically, that memorial is based on the Berlin Monument to the Holocaust. When you go into an open pavilion at this particular museum, hanging from the ceilings are huge stones that represent a particular lynching. It's the inverse of the Berlin Monument that has the stones of destroyed Jewish communities in the ground. On the left-hand side, Bill and Ruth's mass murder, of course, in the Charleston Church in 2015. Both of these things have created a response, a reflection. In this case, many Southerners are now for the first time honestly reckoning with what this means for a free America. Abraham Lincoln, of course, we are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. And so we see racism, we see hatred, we see a lot of these things, of course, and you see them probably daily in your schools and classrooms. However, the vast majority of people, of course, we're seeking to find the better angels of their nature as we move forward. One of the frameworks I find very helpful, and I can mail this to you if this doesn't work in this forum, is something that was presented to us at a conference that I am part of called the Association of Holocaust Organizations. And our meeting was in Europe, in Denmark, and it was the first time Denmark was wrestling with its particular history under Nazi occupation. And all the Scandinavian countries, of course, were doing the same thing. So at this Holocaust in the Nordic Countries conference, this was presented by a colleague from the United Nations, who is asking the question, does education about the Holocaust, about slavery, is it appropriate to use it for educating about civics, about really democratic citizenship? And so developed 4 areas to consider. for me, how this would work, I would every week or so check back on this chart as a reference to say, these are the things we'd like to teach in our classroom to create civic responsibility. How many of these am I actually doing? Am I focused in one category, not the others? It'll be just a nice reminder to every now and again touch base. I'd also invite you to have your students look at this. And as the course or unit goes on, they can discover which ones they are addressing and which ones need to be addressed as well. So it becomes a nice interactive tool. What's at stake for us in our republic in confronting slave history and its connection to Nazism? I'm reiterating things I've already said here, but I think the first thing we must realize is that racism works. And it works politically, but it only works on a short-term basis. Racism begins to hurt everybody involved and thus can only be used really in short terms first politically, at least in modern America. Racism is not only a Jim Crow Southern phenomenon, as I reiterated, and racism and violence inflicted by the white majority emerges in American history as a backlash to political and social progress of targeted minorities. So I've got some bullet points here of times in our history when you have a resurgence of hate crimes, of race baiting, etc. And of course, the most important one will be fighting Republican Reconstruction. I shouldn't say the most, but significant, for that will form much of the mythology that we'll be still wrestling with today. And so you're going to find, of course, quickly that Reconstruction fails, that the Southerners who had separated from the Union and fought the Civil War, of course, soon are re-empowered, and from that, of course, will grow Jim Crow. So the post-Reconstruction era of 1877-1901 is when Jim Crow will be cemented and enforced, and racial segregation will become the norm. Post-World War I, black units were the first to fight in the First World War, the first to be heroized in the newspapers as a recruiting tool. And of course, when they returned home, they were a threat. They were armed, they were trained, they were heroes. And thus you have riots and whole neighborhoods destroyed in 1919 as black veterans heroes return home and are put back in their place. With the New Deal with FDR, one of the caveats, if you would, the Faustian bargain that FDR made is that the Democratic Party controlled the South. They were the dominant force in the Democratic Party. And to pass New Deal legislation, Congress had to approve it. And they did, with the caveat that Southerners would implement any kind of money from the New Deal, which of course meant that any money coming in to rebuild or build infrastructure in the South would be dedicated to white communities, white schools, white roads, white courthouses. And so what we have, of course, is a New Deal, but also sort of a re-entrenchment of Jim Crow. Lynchings go up in 1933. They go down in 1944, of course, because the New Deal has been implemented the way that this group wanted it to be. Response to the Civil Rights Movement, 1950s and 60s, and of course, a response to a black president. We have seen this resurgence. Down below, I've kind of listed some more things here. And one thing we forget is much of the post-war Civil War violence, lynchings and attacks, were also targeted against whites in the South who were rejecting this racial construct and reconstruct. We forget that many Southerners deserted from the Confederate Army. Many really held in question, why are we fighting for a rich, entitled class of enslavers when in fact we don't have any of those privileges? And of course, many wanted to stay loyal to the Union, and many opposed the new KKK that emerges after the war. So from 1882 to 1901, over 1,000 white Southerners are also lynched and murdered, which is typical of any kind of group ready to commit mass atrocity. They always go after their own moderates first before they progress to another stage. Who, again, benefits from racism? Let's talk about the Civil War briefly here. Quoting John Singleton Mosby, leader of Mosby's Rangers, of course, a Confederate cavalry unit. In 1907, as Jim Crow has now been cemented in the South went to war on account of slavery, period. South Carolina went to war, as she said so in her secession proclamation, because slavery would not be secure under Lincoln. South Carolina ought to know what was the cause for her seceding, and I think we also should know that as Americans today. And yet, as I mentioned before, there is white Southern resistance, disillusionment about fighting a war for enslavers. Having said that, how does the war emerge? As the sort of crusade to preserve slavery. It's only after the war that Southerners start talking about the war between the states. For them, this is a war to preserve slavery. So who benefits, of course, from this? In this case, aristocratic Southern enslavers, who are privileged and elite. And a book is published in 1859, sort of sending a warning signal called The Impending Crisis of the South, revealing a growing rift between the wealthy enslavers and the poor whites in the South. This frightened, of course, the enslavers, who have built the whole society on this distance between poor whites and slaves. But if those two start to see a commonality and a common enemy, then of course they could be in trouble. And thus it was to their benefit to argue that Lincoln and the Republican Party that had just come to power was starting a war to free the slaves, which of course the Republican Party outwardly says that it is not at all what we're fighting the war for, and Lincoln himself says, absolutely not, the South can hold its slaves. That truth didn't matter because slavery worked as a motivating tool to frighten poor Southerners. And so they used the fear of abolition of slavery to frighten them to join the army to fight the Civil War. And as we go further this, we must realize that every state that secedes and starting the Civil War, in every one of their declarations of separation, they declare it is to fight for slavery, period. You could even argue that the later construct, that this was about states' rights, was exactly what the Confederacy was determined not to let happen. For example, the Southerners were very upset about the Fugitive Slave Act. That, of course, goes back to 1793 and, of course, is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution under Article 4, which guaranteed the right of slaveholders to recover escaped slaves. Slaves have been escaping to northern states, and northern states were not returning them. This is a violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. But states were arguing we have states' rights to violate a federal act if lives are at stake. So literally, Southerners went to war saying we are opposed to individual states violating federal law, and of course that meant slavery. And in fact, when war breaks out, in that the Republicans want to make sure that the Southerners know this is not a war about slavery, it will become one, but it isn't at the beginning, they adamantly enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and begin returning black slaves to Southern plantations. And again, remember, this is not simply a Southern enslaver problem. There are Northerners who are also invested in the cotton industry in the South as well. When the enslavers bring destruction upon the South, the Civil War, and Richmond, of course, is destroyed, post-war, time for Reconstruction. And assimilationists, of course, at the front here would now argue that blacks have been ruined by slavery. As a race, they need help. But they're worried that if they receive free government handouts, that they will be lazy, docile, as they were as slaves, and be unable to benefit from them. So already assimilists are working in a racial construct that blacks could not rescue themselves. Racists, of course, said, well, blacks can never rescue themselves. They can only be productive under white control and white controllers. Otherwise, they're a burden on society. They're all idle and therefore violent. What's ironic, of course, is that in the Reconstruction program that happened, more than 90% of all the confiscated land occupied by the Union Army or abandoned in the South went to Northern whites. And then it went to former Confederate soldiers. Because, of course, whites could be relied upon to work the land. Blacks, of course, were not given any of the land, and so this argument that they would become docile and lazy was, of course, keeping them away from any kind of chance of civil rights. The anti-racists rejected all of these constructs by pointing out two particular things. That white enslavers were the ones who were idle and lazy, and they did all that based on our labor. And second of all, we used to support ourselves and our masters too. I think we can support only ourselves as well. Immediately after the war, black codes are established in the South. Within 6 months of the end of the war, white supremacy is reestablished in different states in the South. Cruel punishments are meted out to freed blacks to again put them back in their place. And in 1866, the year after the war, the KKK is established. And, of course, wearing the white hoods was to invoke sort of the the ghosts of the Confederate soldiers who had died in this heroic effort to preserve slavery. They, of course, will target blacks and Reconstructionist Republicans. And even some of the language we use about carpetbaggers as being sort of evil constructs. Most of the carpetbaggers were civil rights workers. They were people trying to open schools. These were social rights activists and social workers. Of course, Southerners were terrified of blacks getting education ever since the Nat Turner Rebellion of the 1830s, where Nat Turner, an educated man, realized the position he was in, and massacres took place. So for Southerners, or Southern racists especially, Southern racists, education is a real danger, and thus those trying to promote that are carpetbaggers and scallywags. The Civil Rights Act that comes in 1866 did not criminalize private or local discrimination. All it criminalized was racial language. And so if you were smart, and many racists were, you quickly learned all you had to do is avoid racist language, saying you're doing this for their benefit. And suddenly you could get away with it. You could hide intent and disenfranchisement by never calling it what it was. So blacks are murdered, threatened, harassed until they are disenfranchised by all these tricks the Nazis will later reject as being too illegal for them to implement. And of course, the KKK medallion on the lower left-hand side from the 1920s, you will see its slogan of America First, a slogan we hear, again, echoing, that has a deep-rooted meaning in American history that's directly related to the KKK. What department did President Grant create is a great question for kids to wrestle with. And of course, it's the Department of Justice, which of course is currently under attack by American racists who see this as a problematic institution of government. I just find that ironic. I don't think there's any kind of knowledge there about that, but as you know, General Grant successfully defeated the KKK as a general would with the Department of Justice. The war against emancipation in the South post-Civil War, 1866. Memphis, Tennessee. 48 black Americans killed, at least 5 race, 2 whites as well are killed by a white mob. Many were Confederate veterans. Federal authorities, siding with the Southerners, blamed who? The black troops stationed in Memphis, arguing, of course, as racists do, that if the blacks weren't there, there wouldn't be violence. Democratic newspapers in the South published stories about alleged black violence and crime waves that they, of course, were now trying to stop. And, of course, there was no evidence for this whatsoever. In fact, what happens to these soldiers, ironically, is they're shipped west as buffalo soldiers used by white settlers to displace indigenous Americans. The next one talks about the Colfax riot, so says the sign. On this site occurred the Colfax riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873, marked the end of the carpetbag misrule of the South. So this is a heroic marker fighting the Reconstructionists in the South. On the right-hand side, it is a more accurate depiction of the Colfax murders, because in April of 1873, a black Republican, working, of course, in Reconstruction, a black man, summoned his black supporters to Colfax, warning them of former Confederates' attempt to seize the county seat. They entrenched themselves and dug in, and were simply outgunned and outmanned. The white mob grabbed artillery from the arsenal and just destroyed them. Those who surrendered under a white flag were massacred on the public square as the town watched. This is when federal troops actually arrested some of the perpetrators. None of them will ever be convicted, because by the time they come to trial, Democrats are now reelected into Congress, and the case disappears. 1876, an important year, the centennial. Hamburg, South Carolina, another white mob armed from their rifle club slaughter a black militia. July 4th, note what's going on here. 1877, black militias again are massacred. So as you're looking at these different stories, just some things to consider. First of all, target groups are never passive. They are fighting for their freedom and their lives. So it's a mistake to sort of dehumanize them by calling them docile or just mere victims of this kind of oppression. Many were armed. Many were combat veterans. Having guns did not save them. An issue we're all facing, of course, and this is for a political discussion, you don't have to agree or disagree, but flooding of guns in our society on the argument that this will protect us, of course, has done anything but. And even in this case, having weapons with trained soldiers didn't save them from an overwhelming majority. Assimilation had not saved them. They had come to power. Blacks had now been elected to office for the first time blacks could vote. They were working hand in glove with local whites, building schools, doing wonderful things. However, that was not meant to be. Assimilation was not going to be allowed. The last of the first generation of black lawmakers leaves Congress in 1901, at the height of Jim Crow. So who benefits, and are they interested in who they are provoking? What comes out of this, of course, is the forced labor system that will replace slavery. Slavery, if you would, by another name, post-Civil War. This is what we would know as Jim Crow, of course. And it's all based on the 13th Amendment that read neither slavery nor involuntary servitude would be legal except as a punishment for a crime. Therefore, all you needed to do to avoid any punishment under the Civil Rights Act or under the 13th Amendment was to never use racial language, but simply with racial intent that no one could prove, you could disenfranchise blacks by simply arguing that they, of course, had committed a crime. In 1871, the Virginia Supreme Court declares that prisoners are slaves of the state and denied the rights of human beings. And thus, they couldn't vote, which is what the arrest would do. Then the practice of leasing and selling inmates to corporations became the next step, where suddenly you could make money off of these enslaved blacks, arrested on the most flimsy of charges. And farmers quickly shifted to arresting and leasing black men, mostly by state and county government officials. Labor market brought tens of millions of dollars into southern state treasuries. So this became a very lucrative trade. If you wanted a job post-Civil War, this was the one you wanted. Companies who purchased convicts from the state had little incentive, of course, to waste any money on them. And in Alabama, companies were actually fined if they allowed prisoners to escape. And they, of course, bring back the chain gang you'll see in the lower right. But, of course, this is very disturbing. It looks exactly like slavery, which, of course, is what it was. And so you're going to see, of course, in the South, instances of blacks not being fed or sheltered and dying in mass numbers and being buried in mass graves. At the very bottom, one of those mass graves was unearthed in 2018 in Sugar Land, Texas. County sheriffs, deputies receiving no salary found their salaries via these forced labor operations. And you can see how this, and I go in much more detail in an essay that I provided for you here about how this works. But just to say, in 1929, Missouri sheriffs reported making between $20,000 and $30,000 each. I started as a teacher in 1981, and I made $14,000. So this is, of course, a very lucrative deal. We're about to look at the memory of this before we start looking at the connection to the Nazis. And James Young, of course, memory is never shaped in a vacuum. The motives of memory are never pure. And I like to use, of course, Star Wars here, this wonderful scene where Luke is trained to be a Jedi warrior, and he comes into the cave and he faces off against Darth Vader. And in the combat, he destroys evil, and he, of course, unmasks Darth Vader. And the evil, of course, was himself. And I think what we need to do is to look what we have inside of ourselves as implicit biases about our own history that we need to sort of get out in the open and confront. And if we uncover individual motives and justifications for acts of violence, we, of course, can change the tide. Let me look at the Southern myth of the Civil War embraced by racists. It is, of course, called The Lost Cause. As soon as the war is over, that same year, 1866, a book is published that reframes the war into a lost cause, written by Edward Pollard, who had written before the war, defending the institution of slavery. Images to the right are very popular, of course. The Confederacy is sort of this noble lost cause, and not to degrade their valor on the battlefield, of course, which was there. But what they're fighting for, of course, is not valiant. The myth was that the Civil War was a triumph of Southern bravery, of militaristic glory, of a heroic defense of now, for the first time, states' rights, which no one argued the secession was for. And what, of course, are they arguing now? They are arguing to fight a war against Northern aggression, meaning Reconstruction, post-Civil War, that, of course, would then bring schools to blacks, etc. You have very traumatized, scared people who've been through the hell of the Civil War. And so these ideas begin to take hold amongst traumatized people. Southern warriors are noble, the Northern forces become ruthless killers, and that kind of is summed up in the easy myth of General Lee versus General Grant. General Lee always depicted as sort of the noble man on horseback, which we saw at Charlottesville, and Grant as the drunkard who would throw his troops away, although more troops died under Lee's command than under Grant's. We are victims in a holy cause against this northern aggression. It has a religious overtone. And they start to argue that slavery, though, was a very loving system of white sort of caring for their inferior races, which is a very noblesse oblige thing to do. And so slavery was a very caring system. And then finally, Southerners, of course, don't need Reconstruction. They can rebuild all by themselves and need no help. Now, what I find is a really interesting contrast here, of course, at different levels of implication. But how does this framing of this mythology look like Nazism? Both base this mythology on a false nostalgia for a past that was lost. The mythical construct is based on racism. For the Nazis, they'll argue very similar things. Ongoing victimization after Versailles, during the First World War, by Jews hiding in the rear, trying to destroy us, all these myths based on fear and trauma. The religious aspect that Pollard mentioned, the South must wear the crown of thorns before she can assume that of victory, he writes in The Lost Cause. Hitler on the right in Bavaria often promoted himself as the new Messiah. He often called himself the new Jesus at his mass and repeated rallies, who's going to bring in a new religious future for Germany. Reconstruction, post-World War I Germany, both are fixated on undermining influence of blacks. For the Nazis and proto-Nazis, their first attempts after the First World War was to go after the Rhineland blacks, who had, of course, occupied some of the Rhineland, and a very small number. But the Nazis learned very quickly how to use Southern mythology about race to fight their war against the Rhineland bastards, they called them. The big difference, I would argue, of course, though, for the Nazis, they go a huge scale higher, which is to argue that all the different races out there are part of a large international secret Jewish conspiracy. And once you get to conspiracy theory thinking, this is when it becomes lethal. The myth-making of the South, of course, enshrined in Gone with the Wind. And, of course, first the book in 1936 and the movie in 1939. Just to point out, as the novel begins, Gerald O'Hara, Scarlett's father, is returning from 12 Oaks, the home of Ashley Wilkes. Now, if you look in the movie, 12 Oaks is run by someone called John Wilkes. Only name missing there, of course, is Booth. And, of course, what is the story? He is going to this 12 Oaks to purchase a slave to be a wife for his devoted valet, Bork. What could be more noblesse oblige than that? Spending his own money, of course, to help out his slave and give him a wife. Americans delighted in this and embraced this idea of the noble Southerner who was using slavery in such a noble, wonderful way, acting as sort of a parent to these contented slaves who, in actually the movie that is made, in one point volunteered to fight for the South. There is one black Southerner that I know of who fought for the South, but that one black Southerner, of course, becomes all blacks who were slaves wanted to fight for the South. Looking at the movie, of course, you see a Union soldier lower left-hand side who invades Scarlett's house during the movie, and of course he looks interestingly like General Grant with the same beard, with alcohol, feeding that sort of Grant versus Lee myth, or the flag over Atlanta. Of course, Atlanta burns down because the Confederates set the fire. Having said that, they are dying almost sacrificially here, almost in a Jesus-like way, outside of Atlanta under the flag. On the right-hand side, of course, Scarlett and the big myth, of course, right, that never I will be hungry again, that by herself somehow she resurrected her whole plantation, not with any black help whatsoever, but by the sheer determination of her individual will. So it smashes box office records. It's a panacea for those conflicted by what? It's 1939. Nazism is clear in everybody's face in America. It's after Kristallnacht in Germany. But Americans could say, we're not like them. Yes, they segregate, we segregate. Yes, they kill, yes, we lynch. But in reality, our history is a little different because of this myth that they then, of course, embrace. The myth gets really foundational roots, I would argue, in the centennial year, 1876. And why? Well, Reconstruction begins to end. An economic depression comes in that I just mentioned, allows Southerners who are now back in power as Southern states are brought back into the Union, who then use this economic depression to re-enslave blacks through sharecropping. And, of course, Jim Crow laws are passed by those who are now re-empowered. At the time, the Gilded Age begins to emerge. A new America, you know, all the workers, of course, who were immigrants coming in and building the factories and making all kinds of money. And, of course, those workers had no protections, were exploited, and, of course, buying from the company store. We know this era. Well, of course, this era was about exploitation, of course, of powerless people, especially poor whites. And this, of course, began to sort of echo and become kind of scary. There was a fatigue now about the Civil War. Let's stop talking about Reconstruction of the Civil War and instead focus on the centennial of what it means to be an American. While I was happy, of course, the Gilded Age would lead to the first American empire, first time we created an overseas empire, dominating people of color. And how do you justify that? Well, as the Nazis did, via social Darwinism. This is the right of the white man to do such a thing. Again, racism not confined to the South. And to give you two examples here, on the left-hand side, why is General Custer, that disaster, the little bighorn, the military folly celebrated? It took place in 1876, at a time where Americans were worried about indigenous people, minorities, and others taking away white rights. And so he became the great symbol, of course, a sacrificial, if you would, martyr for the white cause against the heathen. How implicit have we accepted these racial constructs when the president talked about John Lewis, the great hero of civil rights, who almost lost his life that day? All talk, 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 no action or results. How sad. How dare he? And how dare we not respond more vociferously to that? Of course, it becomes part of politics, national politics. The first president to show a movie in the White House was, of course, President Wilson. The movie, of course, was The Birth of a Nation. Wilson, a Southerner, born to a slaveholding family, and, of course, looked at The Birth of a Nation, had it shown there. It's unclear whether or not he knew what it was really going to be about. He is quoted to have said, this is like writing history with lightning, but that was most likely fabricated by Griffith, who was trying to promote the film after having shown it in the White House. His epic would eclipse a minstrel show in the blackface and become the major conveyor of racism in America. And it fed this myth of white victimization. The climatic scene in the movie, the black-faced white actor takes a white woman into the woods. And in one story that I read, there was a crowd in Houston chanting, lynch him, before he kills or rapes the white woman. Then the white woman commits suicide. The film is a huge success, and the North as well. And Americans now had their justification for lynching and segregation. It was to keep, of course, the violent, sex-starved black man, that racial construct, away from decent white women. The star of the movie is the son of a Southerner sheriff who was making a lot of money, of course, in what we've already talked about. And Griffith himself, the son of a Confederate colonel, and the title cards included a version of a pro-Klan quote. The two outcomes in the film, the Klan comes back. Having been defeated by Grant, it is now back at Stone Mountain, 1915. But also, on the other hand, the NAACP begins to organize and to argue for fairness, justice, and equality. How do films enforce and reinforce racial ideas? 1910, a black heavyweight boxer, wealthy, successful, and most problematic, married to a white woman, defeated the great white hope, Jim Jeffries. As a response to this depressing moment for racists, they began to gravitate toward a new series of stories called Tarzan. Tarzan literally means white skin in the language of the apes who raise him. Great stories, of course, but Tarzan became very attractive because what does he do? He goes to the wilds of Africa where the blacks are from and tames the jungle. He protects Jane, the white woman, from all the ravages that Africa could produce. I love the imagery here from the movie. We talk about the sexual racism that were portrayed in blacks, and yet I'm looking at those images there. Other soothing white egos veiled implicit racism. Now that becomes more mass entertainment, whether on purpose or not. 1931, Ernest Cooper, an anthropologist at Harvard, authors Up from the Ape, and describes races that are inferior as ape-like. And of course, now you have an intellect backing this up. From that, of course, sprung King Kong, which is sort of the birth of the nation with a Tarzan-like feel. The black ape comes after the white woman who is in chains. Interesting, right? And he terrorizes white people, eventually brings the woman to the top of the Empire State Building where literally at the end he's lynched by a good white Air Force. that somehow saves the white woman from the evil Negro ape. When you hear racism expressed like apes, imagery here that you'll see, of course, is reinforcing this racial stereotype and racial construct. For the Nazis, you'll see here on the left, immediately going after handicapped people, but photographing them, filming them, lighting them as dangerous-looking blacks. They're learning this from the American South, that survey that was being done. In the middle is Julius Streicher, who, of course, is the publisher of Der Stürmer. His personal copy of the First World War, which, of course, purported to have these black apes coming to rape white women. Or Race to Follow, lower right-hand side, note how the Jew is black. And then, of course, having said all this, I was watching the news literally as the slide was being made, and CNN came on and wanted to know if when the nominee for Florida governor was facing a backlash for saying the state should not monkey this up by electing his Democratic black challenger, the question was, is this racist? I think we have to do better. We have to ask much more difficult questions and not point it in a way that would argue yes and no. Of course, the answer is yes. Who benefits from racism? We'll wrap this up by looking at the Nazis. In 1928, before Hitler comes to power in 1933, Hitler talked about how the Americans gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000 and now keep the modest remnant under observation in a cage. He was talking about reservations, of course. And it's no coincidence that he frames Nazi ideology, the idea of Lebensraum, of living space, as a project of colonization of the Wild East, he called it, which is a direct reference, of course, to the books he was reading about the Wild West. Reservations, of course, would become reservations for slave labor around Lublin, or concentration camps, or ghettos. As Hitler writes Mein Kampf, one of his sources was an American eugenics book, 1916, The Passing of the Great Race, written by a New York lawyer. And Grant was feeding racist fears in America, and then talked about what white Americans, especially well-educated, rich, white Protestant Americans, needed to do to preserve their status. Hitler actually wrote him a fan letter, and in fact, the book itself not only informed the eugenics movement, but also started to form U.S. immigration policy, the 1921 quota system, to preserve what they would say is the Nordic race. That's American language. In Mein Kampf, the Führer refers to the presence of black troops in the French army, this is the Rhineland bastards, as a pollution, a negrification of their once pure race. That's taken almost directly from the passing of the great race that he was reading. Hitler then writes Jews are responsible in Mein Kampf for bringing Negroes into the Rhineland with the ultimate idea of bastardizing the white race. So here we are with this Jewish conspiracy, and then on the right-hand side, this horrific sort of image, but you'll notice, of course, the terrifying black ape who is coming to destroy your civilization. And this is, of course, based on the racism they were discovering in the American South. There were very few blacks in Germany at the time. German eugenicists began to note that American immigration law had been influenced by the eugenics movement, and this is where they figure it out. It isn't Jim Crow that's going to work for them, but the eugenics movement and immigration law. And immigration law and eugenics were meant to keep people out of America due to any kind of hereditary disease. The United States was held in great esteem by the Germans. There were research institutes back and forth and major funding for German eugenics institutes by Americans. The one the Nazis zero in on, of course, was in California, the Human Betterment Foundation, a branch of the American Eugenics Society that was practicing and arguing for sterilizations. And they accounted for nearly half of all sterilizations in the U.S. of those deemed, well, all kinds of categories here, but a racial threat to Americans, especially white, educated Protestant Americans. They had an extensive public education initiative as well that Nazis will pick up upon. In 1936, the Foundation commissioned a survey which revealed that 90% of Californians with some knowledge of the program somehow approved of it. The survey, of course, is quite suspect, but for the Nazis, that meant that only 10% were opposed, and those are the ones who didn't know about it. So Goebbels gets to work and starts to use American propaganda to argue for the racial policies in Germany, and he wants everybody to know about it. As we go forward, here, the U.S. eugenics movement, of course, trying to improve the human population. You may have heard of these sort of contests. Who's the most Aryan-looking baby? My former boss, the emeritus, the historian of the Holocaust at Keene State, won that contest as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy in Middle America. back in the early days. Having said that, of course, 1907, 1929, 200 to 600 sterilizations took place per year in the U.S. It had increased into the thousands by the 1930s, and it's legal in 24 U.S. states. This is what the Nazis are looking at. And they can do better. The way Hitler would phrase it was, the Americans have done a lot of work, but they're limited by their laws, by their constitutions, by human rights. We need to pick up the baton from the Americans. After all, they're a great power. We want to be a great power. They've done this by racism. We can do better. So as we go further, we'll go now to the governor of Georgia saying, I would build a wall of steel, a wall as high as heaven, against the admission of a single one of those Southern Europeans, non-Nordic types who never thought or spoke the language of democracy. So building walls is also part of immigration mythology. As the Nazis scrutinized American U.S. naturalization and immigration policy, they began to discover these kinds of things. 1875, the Page Act. Southern Democrats in Congress had realized the issue of the Chinese labor market. So the Chinese had come to America, had worked on the railways, had connected the East Coast to the West Coast, had started to get active in the gold rush as well, and there were a few 100,000. This, of course, became interesting for Southerners who were facing a recession at home, were looking for cheap labor, and decided one way to utilize cheap labor is to bring these Chinese workers into the South. There actually was a conference held to do this. But of course, what they realized immediately as the first Chinese in small numbers began to arrive in the South is that poor whites said, wait a minute, they're going to come take our jobs at cheaper rates. And suddenly the Southerners remembered how they had played the Civil War, threatening that slaves would be free and take your jobs. And this is where racism becomes part of U.S. national policy, not just Southern Jim Crow policy. The Chinese are equated with slaves coming to steal your jobs. Sexism plays a part of this again, misogyny, of course, because now all Chinese women are labeled as prostitutes. And now we're going to try to make sure the Asians and Chinese do not come into America as a way to sort of spark white outrage against them potentially losing their jobs. Rutherford Hayes, 1876, centennial year, loses the popular vote but becomes president because he promises to end Reconstruction in southern states. Then, of course, those promoting that vote for him. 1876, 1896, you have all this sort of anti-Chinese legislation, local ordinances, racism, that the Southern Democrats suddenly learned this can be better than simply a local California problem. We, in fact, can make this a national issue. And it works, because the next 5 presidential elections are decided by candidates who pander to racist votes and stirring up hatred and fear of Asians. By 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act is a race law that excludes Chinese immigration. There are just over 100,000 Chinese in the U.S. at the time, but they have been made an incredible boogeyman coming to steal the white man's job. Middle of the First World War, 1917, the U.S. passes the Asiatic Barred Zone Act that declares vast sections of Asia as the home of undesirables, language the Nazis will later pick upon, to be barred alongside of homosexuals, idiots, and more. Chinatowns become isolated sort of defended havens that are constantly under attack, almost walled ghettos, and become floodgates open to sort of racial violence against them. Closing the borders then, creating walls to keep Asians and others out, is created at this part of our history. To this point, America prided itself in having open borders. But now racism could be used to sort of prop up Southern white power by arguing that poor immigrants are coming to steal your jobs. In Mein Kampf, Hitler notes that the United States divided inhabitants into 3 categories: citizens, nationals, and non-citizen nationals. He admired this, and he admired the Americans' attempts to keep undesirables out. The Insular Case of 1901, Supreme Court creates second-class citizenship for newly acquired conquered populations. For example, the Puerto Ricans, who of course are a lesser race and don't deserve what the Constitution outlined that they could have, full citizenship rights. So these had to be taken away from these lesser peoples, and the Supreme Court now creates precedent for that. The 1921-24 Immigration Acts were the laws on the books during the Second World War and before, excluded immigrants from undesirable races of Eastern and Southern Europe in favor of Nordic peoples, but then quotas were established, allowing only 164,000 per year to come in. 1928, Hitler's second book second volume of Mein Kampf, he also writes the second book, gives him tons of royalties. So the myth that he creates on the poor, struggling artist is, of course, a myth. He's living in relative comfort because of Mein Kampf. In Mein Kampf, in the second unpublished edition, you can see that he is incorporating the Immigration Acts in 1920 and 24 into his language to help build the Nazi platform. The quota system ends in 1965 under Lyndon Johnson. The Back to the Prussian Memorandum of 1933, where they had sent a team to explore the American South and discovered Jim Crow wouldn't work, but immigration policy certainly would. The Nazis worried about Jewish assimilation back home. Of course, they had been assimilated for 400 years. Nothing stood out that made them look different unless you were from Orthodox churches, which most Germans weren't. And they were afraid of a backlash. Yes, of course, they attacked Jews outright, which, of course, they discovered April 1st, 1933. It was a huge backlash to their attempt to boycott Jewish stores. Instead, they began to focus on defining what a Jew is in much the same way that Americans defined what Negroes were, which, of course, outside the law, had to do with heritage and who were black in your ancestry. Nazis were deeply worried about American black attempts to assimilate, to hide. You'll often see ads against blacks straightening their hair or using white cream to lighten their skin. In fact, there's a very interesting film in 1949 from my hometown of Keene, New Hampshire called Lost Boundaries that tells the true story of a doctor in Keene who was passing himself off as white but was black. And it's discovered when he tries to join the Navy and fight in the Second World War. And that still resonates in our town today. Meanwhile, Hitler has been studying the eugenics movement, and he has noticed that sterilization is not only being argued, but being used legally in 24 states. German researchers begin to focus on this and notice that Americans are using it randomly for punishment. For the Nazis, that's interesting, but arbitrary. They needed something much more concrete. Even though the U.S. appeared to be the most liberal nation in the world, Germans and economists noted that Americans and politicians are very able to maneuver around and implement racial laws. Which leads us to Nazi racial law, and we're just about done. July 14th, 1933. This is the day, of course, that Hitler makes the Nazi Party the only legal party in Germany. And for those who aren't getting the connection, this is Bastille Day. This is an overt Nazi statement that says we are in opposition to the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, to life, liberty, equality, and all the ideals coming out of the American and French Revolutions. In fact, their new scientific revolution would be eugenics, which was all about inequality, not equality. So the law on preventing hereditary ill progeny, this, of course, would allow sterilization for those who didn't want to have children that would somehow influence the race, is almost entirely based on the California law that was already there. So the lawyers are using that as precedent. Hitler's early eugenics initiatives received praise from American eugenics members who say that Hitler is going further than we are and is actually creating a policy that gives us great courage to move forward because all we're doing is hopefully wiping out crime because that all comes from minorities, from bad blood, and making a better world. Nazi laws were soon seen as a positive advancement against criminal activity. If you can target people, of course, who you are criminals and sterilize them, but we know more criminals was the argument. And the Germans began to centralize the eugenics laws, something the Americans never do. It was all state-based. But for the Nazis, they go on a much larger project almost immediately. 30 states declared mixed marriages invalid. Many of those states threatened those who did not with very harsh punishment. This was unique in the world at the time. And for the Nazis still working on the Nuremberg laws, they have the eugenics precedent, they have the immigration precedent. When they read U.S. marriage laws, they have the last piece of the puzzle. And they realize that you can criminalize marriage between races. And this will be, of course, the basis of the Nuremberg laws. This has ended in 1967 in America. So America, anti-miscegenation laws also have a separate classification which was based on a eugenics formulation of mongrel. And these laws had developed due to slave masters who, of course, were raping their female slaves. And they needed to distinguish between who belonged to their race and who did not because their progeny, of course, could be mulatto or white-skinned, and they had to sort of identify what that was to preserve the race. When we get the Nuremberg laws in September 35, the law to protect German blood and honor is now a much more Nazi construct. It has been based in the studies of America, but it's sort of their own kind of thing out of here, unlike the earlier law in 1933. But it does forbid marriages, extramarital intercourse between Jews and Germans, and employment issues, etc. You know the law. The Reich citizenship law, this is something the Americans never did, which is to base citizenship on blood and blood type. Well, of course, in that there's only one race, the human race, this became very problematic because there was no separate blood type for Jew. But that's what the Nuremberg laws were doing. They're going a step further. As part of the Nazi educational efforts, learned from California, Johann von Leers writes a book, and he talks about the early drafting of the Nuremberg days, and he talks in a tour through the history of the peoples. He talks about America's 14th Amendment. There's 23 pages devoted to American race law, which is where the Nazis were getting their precedent from. 8 days later, a delegation sails to the U.S. for hopefully a hero's welcome, but unfortunately arrive in New York City, which is a hotbed of anti-Nazi, anti-fascist activity, and the trip didn't go well. Despite being targeted, American minorities give us direction and hope against racists. For example, 1898, after Chinese ghettos and towns were being attacked, one immigrant, on his own courage, went to the Supreme Court and filed basically a claim saying that the 14th Amendment protects all people, not just citizens. Read it carefully. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor. And in fact, this is where birthright citizenship becomes U.S. law. And despite what was said politically, the U.S. is one of 30 countries to have birthright citizenship. October 2018, President Trump promises to unilaterally end birthright citizenship, claiming that almost no one does it. Why? It's the midterms, and he's using racism, of course, and the crucial midterms to try to get votes. White Americans, of course, remained isolationist to the Nazi movement, but black Americans didn't, and black Americans, like John Robinson, went to Ethiopia and started to fight the fascists, and trying to be, of course, a signal to what was at stake. So not only did black Americans warn us about the fascist threat first, they knew what that meant, they also helped us beat it in the Second World War, because here our brown condor fought in Ethiopia comes home to America, whereby he finds the Tuskegee Airmen, who is one of the best fighter units we have in the Second World War. Leadership matters, of course. When you have this kind of stuff we've been dealing with, and hate crimes going up, and again, mostly by white supremacists, we can despair or we can hope. And I would say that in the 1930s we have great examples. We have Americans who stood up to the German Bund, who tried to build camps near Yale to try to tie it to the America First movement. And on Thanksgiving, Americans protested a new Bund camp being built in Connecticut. And so you can see the picture down below. And the Bund never gets a camp there. And I think Americans yearn for a fairer way of life, and we embrace hope over fear, and the promise that our system gives for justice. And we are better because I think of our reformers. FDR, of course, would phrase this in his inaugural address that the only thing we have to fear is, in fact, fear itself. And in the South, of course, they are now grappling with this history to their great credit here in LaGrange, Georgia. The town is accepting responsibility for lynching that took place here. And on a personal note, on the right-hand side is someone you should know. His name is Jonathan Daniels, an Episcopal priest from Keene, New Hampshire, again, my hometown, who is a civil rights martyr. In 1965, he was registering voters in the South. Mysteriously released from jail, went across to get a soda. A little black girl was in front of him, and the white sheriff leveled his shotgun and fired. John jumped in front of the blast and was killed instantly and blown across the square. In the trial, the killer was found innocent by an all-white male jury, and I was just a kid when that happened. So again, this American problem. But John didn't parachute in to rescue anybody. He went to them and said, "How can I help you?" And they gave him advice. One of the most moving moments of my life came when my family visited Canterbury Cathedral in England, because John is only one of two saints in the Episcopal Church who are American. And here is the Book of Martyrs at the place where Thomas Becket was murdered. And here we are looking at two images in England. One is for Martin Luther King, the other for Jonathan Daniels. And on the right is John's statue that's in the National Cathedral that, of course, it has been in the news the last couple of days. I'm going to wrap this up, and then we'll look at questions. Americans' encounter with its past, with racism, with the Nazis, of course, clearly drew parallels. Southerners weren't making the same parallels that black Southerners were. As they began to fight this war against racism and segregation, the question was, what does that mean for us as well? And of course, a double V campaign comes out of this. The double V campaign means victory at home and abroad. As we fight Nazis, we're fighting them here, of course, as well. And the cartoon, of course, illustrates that a bit. When Eisenhower goes to Ohrdruf Camp, and he sees, of course, the burned bodies charred here, who could not help but think of the burned, charred bodies of Jim Crow lynching mobs. And he clearly stated and changed the direction of America. We are told that an American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against. And that fight, I think, is ongoing. And I think we make a sea change towards civil rights. This is stuff you know. It's going to be in the PowerPoint. You can read it. But currently, the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, is under attack by American racists who are trying to disenfranchise black voters again, try to take away the rights of the Voting Rights Act, et cetera. You can read this slide on your own or the essay that I provide. And finally, law and order. You should know our code words for racists with an agenda, and any candidate in trouble often will use this. I'm a man of law and order, which often translates to, of course, putting blacks and minorities in jails, because, of course, they're the ones committing all the crimes. And I try to illustrate here that kind of tradition in American society and why we now have the greatest percentage of people in jail by far in the world relative to anyone else. It is mostly minorities. 2.3 million people behind bars, and there are more U.S. citizens with a criminal record than the combined populations of the world's largest city, Tokyo and California combined. 5% of the world's population, 21% of the world's prisoners. And much of that, not all, but much, is racially based. What does success look like as we wind this up? I would say it looks like, first of all, not me or anyone else spouting an agenda, but it is about listening to the targeted. And they will tell us whether or not things are improving for them or not. I don't think it means success means nothing happens. I think success means we start seeing minorities contributing, feeling free, living the American dream. And in this case, here's the memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And again, the lynchings, things hanging from the ceiling, are mirroring what happened in Berlin. And we have the Tuskegee Airmen as simply an example. Or for the indigenous people, which I didn't have time to spend on, of course, their history, they still loyal American citizens. And thank goodness for the Navajo code breakers who helped us also win the Second World War. So with that in mind, I thank you for all that you do. This is my contact information. I have provided for you 2 separate essays I've written on this. I have others as well. So I just look forward to helping you and learning from your experience in the classroom as well. So thank you very much for taking the time this evening.
Okay, thanks, Tom. We've had maybe about half a dozen questions come in, and I'm going to kind of help sort through those and maybe paraphrase a couple of them and start moving us through those. So I'll start with, can we liken Jim Crow with the school to prison pipeline that we have nowadays?
And I will deal with this in the essay a bit, and I would say yes, but always with caution. Any kind of overt general statement always has exceptions and always leads down the path of, either or thinking. But without a doubt, much of incarceration of minorities, especially blacks, you're going to see how the law is different for blacks versus whites, especially in drug-related crimes, and certainly is something to consider. I think there's a direct connection there, if you would, sort of a new re-enslavement. As you know, once they are arrested, they no longer have the right to vote, which, of course, is also part of this. So I would say, yes, there is a certain direct connection between those two phenomena.
Okay, thanks. Can you comment a little bit on the Confederate flag? There's, some people are confused about when that came about and who fought under that flag, et cetera.
Right. So there are a couple issues here. One, of course, this is the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. And it only becomes sort of state flags in most southern states really in the 1920s or 1960s. I think it was South Carolina who adopted in the 60s, if I remember correctly. So these become overt symbols of post-Civil War Southern mythology about this war between the states, which is rooted in a racial construct. And not, of course, ever saying, well, slavery was a bad thing and that's what we were actually fighting for. So we see, for example, Confederate statues. The great majority of them were put up in the 1920s or the 1960s or 70s, when I was in a conference in Mobile just this past June with my association, there was a statue right across the street of a Confederate soldier that had nothing to do with the Civil War. It had been put up in the late 60s, early 70s, when 3 Northerners were killed in the South by the KKK, and this statue was put up right in front of the courthouse. So these have nothing to do with the Civil War, the vast majority of them. Some do. In Confederate graveyards, I have no issues with them whatsoever, but when they're in a public place, put up specifically at times of response to any kind of liberation or equality, and specifically put up in public places of access to justice, courthouses, that kind of thing, these are intimidation symbols. These aren't historic symbols. And I deal with that a lot more in my essay as well. I would argue that, yes, they do need to come down, but also to be very, very sensitive here that how we do this. We're talking about an implicit narrative of history that has been embraced by people, and you're stepping, of course, on their own mythology. So I think you need to sort of respect that, but at the same time, use this as a moment to educate. So I kind of, in my mind, would say, take down the statues, but leave the pedestals, and talk about what that means. But this is very difficult, of course, an emotional topic. But for me, the Confederate flag is nothing less than a symbol of racism and enforcing racial divides, constructs, and murder, and has nothing to do with the Civil War.
Okay, thank you. So, Tom, our para-educators often work with children who have developmental disabilities. Can you comment on the vulnerabilities of such children under fascism?
Of course, and the Nazis, after they sort of had gone after the Rhineland blacks, their next target group, and the very first target group, even before Jews, even though that was their main program, were German handicapped. From their perspective, those that were mentally or physically handicapped. And the Nazis will develop a program called T4. And T4 is basically run by professional doctors and bureaucrats. And it becomes systemic between German hospitals. I think almost 400 hospitals take part in this as a way to sort of sterilize handicapped people so they have no offspring. And the system that is created and the conferences that are held and the propaganda that's made and the certificates that are granted are often based on the American eugenics project. So again, they learn how to organize and professionalize eugenics on a national scale in Germany. And of course, one of their first targets in racial thinking, of course, were handicapped to Hitler, a threat to the Aryan race.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll just go ahead and read this one verbatim. Tom, some of my colleagues avoid discussing these issues or at least making contemporary connections because they fear being labeled as too political biased, etc.
Right.
They don't want to deal with angry kids, parents, administrators. I think we do our students and our democracy a disservice when we don't push our kids to think about the connections between the past and present. My question, though, is how do you suggest we tell the truth about facing real problems in our jobs?
Primary documents. So using primary source material, talking about the history that I've just outlined. We're talking about, the 1870s and the 1920s, not today, of course. And when using current documents, like I used one about the politician from Minnesota, you have kids wrestle with that. So you do not become the person who is my opinion versus yours. You are presenting historical fact that kids have to wrestle with. I think we must, but I totally understand India's question here, and this is what I face all the time. Even in the North, we have Confederate flags that depict the South, and my argument would be that's unfair to a lot of Southerners, though a minority, who of course never bought into this. So why frame all of them as sort of under this Confederate flag? There are many very decent Southerners, of course, who reject that as Northerners did too, and many Northerners that embrace the racial construct as well. So these limiting symbols need to be looked at for what they are, in this case, proponents of racism. But the question is spot on, and this is the difficulty educators would face in public schools, of course, is to sort of say they're on a bully pulpit. And in that, we have had empowerment of misogyny. We have had empowerment of the KKK by our own government in the past few years. It's a very dangerous and tenuous situation. And so I would argue that we must start first with principals, working in schools, talking about how this is important. And in fact, that's a project I'm working on right now. because principals are in the same boat. How do we deal with this? We know it's wrong, but at the same time, we don't want to sort of create this either-or dynamic. So remove that from the table. It's not either-or. It is what America is for, what our founders meant to talk about, what we fought a war over, what the symbols mean, but use primary documents as your way in. When I go in, I'm talking about the Nazis. Kids are making their own connections about what's going on today. But we can't avoid the American Bund, reflected in Charlottesville modern times. None of this stuff comes out of the ether, out of nowhere. It's rooted in the American experience. So it's very important to confront that, but I would say primary documents. Let them talk through the documents, not at you.
Great. Tom, do you have any resources that are themed for the younger students? This questioner says, I work with elementary students. They aren't learning about the Civil War and Nazism as you presented to us, but we can expose them to the basic themes. Do you have ideas about that?
Yeah, and I would say really important when I teach in elementary school, I'm barely ever talking about Nazism or that kind of stuff, but I'm talking about the stuff that I love elementary teachers and middle school teachers too, who are talking about decency, about bullying, about really the issues that are at stake for humanity that way. There are tons of resources out there. I would suggest the first place to start would be Facing History in Ourselves, out of Massachusetts. There are many others, but I think that's the kind of question that I'd like to sort of bounce off of fellow teachers. I've been out of the classroom now for a number of years, and they will have better resources than I will.
Okay.
One of the great books, of course, is The Terrible Things by Eve Bunting, which is a terrific metaphoric book that can be used in middle, elementary, or high school, but it's talking about the issues that are raised here. It's a sort of a metaphor of what happened to the Jews in Germany, but told in a way that kids get. It's about othering other people.
Great. Tom, what if I'm one of the NEA members who is a custodian or a food service worker or a school bus driver? Why should I know about history, or particularly this history?
They're going to be the first people, I think, to identify it and see it on a bus, on a bathroom. Graffiti now in the last few years, swastikas, the anti-Semitic stuff is happening everywhere, even in New Hampshire, right? It's going through the roof. They're the first ones finding it, and so what our custodians here do, of course, immediately document it, report it to the school administrators who are trained about how to deal with this kind of issue, when and how to do it. So dealing with these kind of provocations is really important, but the first line of defense and ground troops on this thing, I think, are our custodians, our food staff and all those folks. They're going to hear it, they're going to see it, often long before any of us do.
Great. And I've got a follow-up question here. Tom, can you repeat what you said about the MA resource? I couldn't quite get it.
I'm sorry, Facing History and Ourselves.
Okay, great. Why do so many people believe that the Civil War was fought for states' rights, thus a noble cause? Where did that idea come from?
So we have, of course, after the war, textbooks come in. And, of course, all through the South, and, of course, we know that tradition, right, of where textbooks currently come from now. But what you have is that narrative really enforced once Reconstruction and once schools are really basically only for whites. So the curriculum, it's deeply rooted in the curriculum and all the history books. And, in fact, still you can find references there. So this becomes sort of generationally an accepted mythology that who's going to question, right? It becomes part of your identity.
Right. Tom, can you touch on President Hayes removing troops from the South?
Right. So here he was losing, of course, and realizes right away to do that he is going to say Reconstruction will end, which, of course, I forget exactly how the voting goes, but it allows those who are in favor. By this time, many Northerners had tired of Reconstruction as well. Many wanted the Southern economy to sort of come back because they wanted to invest in it. By this point, the Republican Party itself is fracturing, and you're starting to see sort of this pull to end Reconstruction. And so he gets support from Northerners as well to end Reconstruction, which then, of course, cements the Southern vote once they come in for him as well.
Okay, and finally, do you have any resources for a high school media class?
High school media class. So we're talking films and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that would be my guess.
There are two things that come to mind off the top. PBS just had a series about American eugenics. I think it was a 2-hour program. I forgot the name, but you can find it on PBS. There's also another movie called Slavery by Another Name, which is on PBS as well, which highlights a lot of this. Those are the two that stand out, and I'm sure there are a whole lot more, but those are the first two that come to mind.
Okay, I think we got through all of our questions. So I want to thank you once again for putting this webinar on for our members. There was a lot of enthusiasm tonight on the webinar for good reason. It was a great topic and a great presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, very much. I just would encourage folks to keep working at this and talk to each other and your administrators as well. You're doing the right work for the Republic. And just as my last statement, American eugenicists see what was going on in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and begin to reject its constructs and its racism and realize the error of its ways. So America begins to shift, even eugenicists, which will, of course, lead to the civil rights movement.
Great. Well, now I'm going to turn this back over to my colleague, Jessica Brinkley, to take us home on this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Tom. This will conclude the question and answer portion of this webinar. I would like to thank everyone for their active participation during the session this evening. And we believe that we answered all the questions, but as we scroll back through the chat area, if we find any that we've missed, we will be sure to follow with you. On behalf of the Center for Great Public Schools, NEA ESP Quality Department, I would like to thank you for taking the time to participate in tonight's webinar. Please be sure to visit www.nea.org/ESPPD to stay up to date with both recorded and upcoming webinar sessions. We look forward to your participation in future NEA webinars. Thank you, and have a good evening.